right, everybody, let's begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Saint Isidore the Farmer, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Thank you, everyone, for being here. My name is Damiano, and I am glad to have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Alex Plato and Mr. Michael Guidice. These gentlemen will be speaking about distributism, its effects, and why Catholics should care. Before these gentlemen speak, I want to comment about the effects of modernity. And I want to also briefly talk about distributism. So the men who concocted modernism say that man is exalted and that he has autonomy, like imagining a man as a free-floating individual, sovereign, and owes no obedience to anything or to anyone. This is an error. It makes one beg to ask the question, what has modernism brought us? It has brought us the corruption of our youth, the destruction of families, and most of all, the erosion of man's relationship with God. Capitalism and socialism are conduits for modernism. Catholics should look for a third way, and I do heartily believe that distributism is that third way. Since it is not merely just an economic theory, it is a vision, a moral vision where property is widely distributed, where families are strengthened, where work is catered towards the family and not the other way around. With that out of the way, I will give an outline as to what this evening's talk will look like. Both speakers will be speaking about distributism, as you already know. Following that, we will discuss certain things about distributism, like where it struggles, what some people have problems with, and what it is and what it is not. And then afterwards, the audience will be free to ask questions. There are also pens on each of your tables where you can write on the index cards, and there will be a person that will collect right here the questions that you have if you're too shy to come up. But if you're not shy, you will come over here, and a microphone will be held by that very same person for you to ask us questions. With that out of the way, I would like to have Michael Thomas start. Thank you.
Great, so this is great. This is my first time on behalf of the land movement coming to talk to a university body, student body. So on behalf of the Catholic Land Movement, I want to thank Damiano, the chapter here, and everybody for coming. Thanks so much for coming. We're very excited to be here. And this is actually the first college campus where we have established a land movement chapter. So this is novel, as novel to me as it is to anybody else here. I've helped mature dozens and dozens of chapters, but usually they're lay associations out in the community. This is the first time we have one here, and I'm excited to see what fruit comes of that relationship with the university. Even the structure of this talk is, I'm usually talking in like living rooms without a microphone to a group of agrarians or Catholic farmers or people who are trending in that direction. When I start a talk, well, actually, I got to introduce myself. So I'm Mike Thomas. He used my real name, which is Mike Guidice, but a lot of people in the land movement know me as Mike Thomas. So you'll see that interchangeably. But I am the current director of the Catholic Land Movement, and I ended up there somewhat haphazardly. About 4 years ago, me and a group of friends decided to have a conference where we discussed the Catholic Land Movement. We put together a 2-3 day conference, complete with liturgy and a bunch of workshops on agrarian handicrafts and skills. And within 2 weeks, about 350 people had signed up to attend the conference, like absolutely astounding us at what the reaction was to us putting out this conference idea. From there, after those 3 days of conference, people were so inspired. It was, learning how to slaughter pigs or keep gardens or make soap or make cheese, like 3 full days of that with liturgy and sacraments and other things. And at the end of those 3 days, the bonds that had been joined between the people, that had been created between the people at the conference were so strong that they were like, we want to go back and continue this type of fellowship and association in our parishes. And from that, the chapter network was born. And I'm happy to say that the Land Movement now has 40 chapters across the country. There's thousands of people that are participating in Land Movement events. There are Land Movement events almost every single weekend. I've been traveling every weekend for the past month to various places to attend Land Movement events. That is all culminated into the last year. We had an invitation to Rome, and we presented the work of the Land Movement to the Holy Father, and he was very happy to receive the work of the Land Movement. And so that's what's going on with the Land Movement. It's a very exciting and joyful and in a very kind of robust phase of growth. And you students at Steubenville Franciscan University are part of that. So the Land Movement has made it here in some way, and Damiano gave me a call, wrote me an email, and I was like, I want to get something started. And so we've been working to make that happen. So that's who I am. That's why I'm here. My goal here is to help energize you guys around the motivating principles of why. Why Catholic agrarianism? And what does it relate to as far as Catholic moral thinking, Catholic social doctrine? Where does the Land Movement fit into that matrix of things? And so that's what I'm here to discuss tonight, to give you guys a really strong grounding in first principles and motivating principles, so therefore you can identify goals and tactics and action past there. But we need to understand where we come from in order to really orient ourselves for a proper destination. So with that said, it's a Catholic university, but I always like to gauge my audience a little bit. How many people here are already moderately familiar with the concept of distributism? Could you raise your hands? Great. That is a better catechized audience than I usually deal with. A lot of times I say that to farmers or rural people, and they're like, that sounds like communism. So it's great to know that we've already kind of, you guys have a little bit of a grip on it. How many people here have read Rerum Novarum? Very good, Catholic University. Good job, teacher. So that's great. That is really the foundational, principle and part of it. So now the next question is the really important one. How many people are here tonight because in the future, when you leave college, your intention is to start a productive household, when I say that, like a household productive in primary things and in direct economic relationship with your neighbors? How many people have the intent to start a homestead or get involved in producing their primary things? Less hands, but good. My goal is to get the hands that went up halfway to get up all the way, and to get more of you to go up even more. So that's my goal here, is to inspire you guys about the why around that. That's enough. I can pass it to you now if you want to introduce yourself, or you got your own mic, I think.
I've been directed by the chief of the operations here to stand up. So is this good? Good volume. Okay. Well, I am so happy to be here. Thank you so much, Damiano. I'm so glad that I met you and you got me involved in this, and I've met Mike as well and talked on the phone. And I'm really interested in learn a lot more about the Catholic Land Movement as well. Actually, I'm not super familiar with it. I know about it. So I should say a little bit about myself. I'm a professor here at Franciscan, and I'm also a fellow of New Polity, which is a think tank downtown. And so I'm very interested in these social questions. And I would say that as a distributist, I'm not here to talk about, the history of distributism, or to open up all the documents of distributism and give you some sort of expertise on that, because I'm not an expert. But what I am is I am a committed distributist, and I've got my own developed understanding of what distributism is. And so I want to share a little bit about what that is. And then I'd love to have some questions and answers. I'd love to have some discussion. A lot of my best thinking comes out in class, where I get the back and forth going on. So that, I hope we can get to that and cover some things. So, I was asked to discuss what is distributism. Now, I love what is X questions because I'm a philosopher. That's what Socrates asked, right? What is X? What is justice? What is virtue? What is knowledge, right? What is friendship? All these questions, they're great questions. And of course, when we ask a what is question, we're asking for a definition, right? And a good definition is a definition where you give a genus, a classification, and then you say specifically where your particular item fits within that class and is different than the other things within that class. And what I find in a lot of discussions of distributism is we have to talk about that definition, and which means we have to talk about this word distributism, right? And so I don't want it to be a discussion of the word itself, but of the concepts involved. And so I think that when we get into discussions about distributism, those who want to defend it and those who want to critique it, there's different genuses, right, that people actually locate distributism in before they try to specify what it is. So I want to say a little bit about that. And so oftentimes when I get into discussions with distributism with people that do not agree to distributism, whatever they understand that to be, they often think that distributism is some sort of an economic policy, right? This is an economic policy. It's not a capitalistic policy or a right-wing economic policy. It's not a left-wing policy or socialistic policy. And so it's some other kind of policy. Well, I would say it's not any kind of policy. That's not what distributism is. Now, it might have implications with respect to policies, right? But it's not primarily about policies. And some people might say, well, you know, it's not capitalism and it's not socialism and it's a third way. And then if people are thinking that way, they might think, oh, distributism is a system. It's an economic system, right? Kind of like socialism is an economic system and capitalism an economic system. And this is a different one that's not those. I don't think it's an economic system, right? I don't even know exactly what an economic system is, okay? But at any rate, it's not one of those, in my opinion. It might have implications with respect to how we understand, right, those questions, large-scale questions about economic institutions, economic structures, right, those sorts of things. So it's not an economic system, it's not an economic policy. What about politics? Is it some sort of political point of view? Well, you might say, well, it's not really, you know, a sort of capitalistic side of things. It's not that kind of libertarian thing, and it's not a socialist sort of big government kind of thing, and so it's some other sort of political thing. Well, again, I don't think it's that either. Okay, now I think it has implications with respect to political perspectives, political institutions, political theory, but that's not what it is either. It's like, oh my gosh, what is it? What's left? I think distributism should be understood in one of two ways or even both, right? I think distributism is a social philosophy. And so it's a social philosophy, but it's also a social philosophy that, because it's a social philosophy, has something to say about what we should be doing about living together in society and community. And so fundamentally, it's a social philosophy. Why is that? Well, here's a little bit about the history that you already know. The sort of historic classical distributists, Chesterton and Belloc, who I'm most familiar with, although Vincent McNabb is a big voice as well, they would say that what they're trying to do is implement Catholic social teaching. Of course, what they meant at that time was Rerum Novarum and Leo XIII's teaching. Right? And so what they're trying to do is implement that in England at that time, right? That's how they began. But with, you might say, not directly relying on the theological side of social teaching, but the philosophical side. So I think really one way to understand it is it's taking the philosophical principles within Catholic social teaching, trying to collate those, understand those within our current context in history, right? And then try to live those out better. So that's what it is. I think it's a social philosophy. That means it has an implication not about economics only. It's not primarily economics. It's not even primarily political, although it's that too. It's also cultural, right? And I think this is the big thing that people miss. It also has to do with religion, right? And if we understand the nature of society the way the distributists did, then we see that order, right? First and fundamentally, society is religious. Every society is religious. We even have our religion nowadays, though we say we don't. Right? So our secular world has a religion underneath, right? It might not call it a religion, but it's still a fundamental position with respect to man's ultimate origins, man's ultimate destiny, the source of right and wrong, how we are to get in connection with anything transcendent, what we're to do about that together, right? So it is a fundamental perspective that every human society has. I follow the thinker Christopher Dawson in this that I highly recommend. I think he is, I don't know if he ever said anything about distributism personally, but I claim him as a distributist. I claim a lot of people as a distributist who wouldn't say they are, as I understand it. And I'll try to explain that a little bit more later too. So Christopher Dawson's famous for arguing that religion is the key to history. So understanding every civilization, every simple culture, every big culture, and every time and every place, we have to understand its ultimate perspective, its ultimate religious point of view, its ultimate desires. So our secular era is one that's religious as well, and I would suggest to confirm that, try to keep track of, or try to describe what's happening socially in terms of religious language. So if we say, who are the priests today, right? And what is the priestcraft? Well, you'd probably get somewhere talking about scientists, technologists, right, and other things like that, right? And you might say, well, what are our liturgies? What do we really care about, right? What do we celebrate together, right? And you could look at that and figure out that's a way to look at things religiously, right? You could say, who are treated as the ones that we should marginalize and we should treat as people that are on the fringes of society? Who are the fringes? A term for that in a tradition would be heretics. Who are the heretics? So we can use these religious words and it captures what we're doing. We could even ask this question, which is a fundamentally religious question. What do we sacrifice and what do we sacrifice it for? And I think that's a huge question. We could go on a long tangent about our culture. So back up a little bit. Distributism as a social philosophy is a fundamental view about the nature of religion and therefore culture and therefore politics and therefore economics. So when I get into discussions with people that are critics and they say, well, I don't really like distributism because they want to, like Belloc says in Restoration of Property, we need strong state regulations. And that sounds socialistic to me, so I'm not interested in distributism. Well, it's interesting if you read Belloc, right, he says of those very policies that he was recommending in Restoration of Property, he said, you know what, those are my best pragmatic attempt, right, to apply the principles that I've been defending as distributism. So he knows there's a distinction between applying principles prudentially to a specific time in a specific place, right, and the very principles that give creative sources to what policies we're going to be trying to apply. So I think that distinction is important within a philosophy, and it gives us an ability to say, well, maybe Belloc didn't understand everything perfectly economically, right, for our time. Well, why would he? Or how could he? He hasn't lived in our time, okay? So a lot of those critiques I just dismiss. Those to me seem unimportant. Okay, so the first thing is distributism. It's not an economic system. It's not an economic policy. It's not primarily about economics, right? It's not even primarily about politics, right? It's primarily about religion and culture. And the way I think to see this is to understand one of Belloc's best writings and books, in my opinion, is called The Crisis of Civilization. He wrote it in 1937. It was a series of lectures he gave at Fordham University. And in that book, he basically tells the history of Western civilization, right? And the whole first part of the book, the first 4 chapters are talking about how did the Catholic Church come about, right? How did it reach its kind of apex in the High Middle Ages? How did it begin to break down? And how did it reach its disaster point in the Reformation era, right? And what are the consequences of the Reformation era on us socially, politically, culturally, religiously, right? And then the final chapter, which is called Restoration, remember the name of the book is Crisis of Civilization. He's interested in restoring civilization, Western civilization, Catholic civilization. And he says in that chapter, that's where he has like a tour de force of distributism. But what's interesting there is what he says, and this I want to talk about as the radical element in distributism as a social philosophy. He says, we need a whole new scheme of social institutions. And if we don't have a whole new scheme, this is his phrase, a whole new scheme of social institutions, right, then all of these reforms we have about restoring property, distributing property, restoring the guild system, breaking up monopolies, all that, he says, will be a completely futile attempt, right? So we need a new scheme of institutions. He says, how do you do that? How do you get a whole new scheme of social institutions? It's not by economic policies, right? It might help, right? He said it's fundamentally by rebuilding Catholic culture. So now we have a concept of what might be called effective distributism. How do you have an effective distributism where property, which is the number one sort of focus of distributist activism, how to get more productive property distributed amongst more fundamental units of society, which fundamentally that's families, right? How do we get that more distributed to more people? And what Belloc said is we have to rebuild Catholic culture. Without that, all these efforts will be in vain. And so that to me is a much more radical vision than a merely political or merely economic thing. Okay, so distributism is a social philosophy. It's also even more, it's deeper than that, I think, now. Because it's been how long since the distributists started writing, and how many distributists through how many decades have there been, right? Lots of different types of people, like myself, right? Mike here, you've got somebody like John Madai, right? You've got a lot of different people who vary on certain questions, right? And you have now the movement which is called localism. There's a recent book that came out, and you can read the sort of people, and they're very different, right? They have a lot of different perspectives, but they all share something in common. right? This interest in this social philosophy called distributism, but they're all doing this sort of thing even when they disagree, so it's even bigger now than a social philosophy. It's a tradition of thought. It's a tradition of thought. So I'm part of this distributist tradition of thought, and I would say there's 3 fundamental enemies to the distributist, and there's one fundamental goal. The fundamental goal is the health of the family, right, as the focus of a healthy society, and there's a lot that goes with that. And then there's 3 fundamental enemies, and I'm going to use names that came from Chesterton's book, What's Wrong with the World. He talks about the sort of, curmudgeonly conservative, kind of right-wing Tory, I guess I could say. And then you've got kind of the radical, crazy vegetarian Whig, right, the sort of left-wing socialist side of things. And he calls these characters Hudge and Gudge. Right? So Hudge is his name for the sort of radical left wing. So that's sort of like socialism, I would say. The problem with big government, okay? So big government, let's call that Hudge. And that's one of the enemies. Why is that an enemy, right, of the family? Well, because it centralizes power, right? It centralizes power in that institution, right, of the modern state, okay? And that has deleterious consequences for the health of the family. So Hudge is the first enemy, so we need to do something about that. And I think, again, not merely political, not merely economic, something deeper, religion and culture. And we can talk about that later if you want to go into that side of things. The next character he called Gudge, which think of that as the right-wing person, the kind of economic libertarian sort of point of view. So I think that side of things, which he called Gudge, right, we can say the enemy there is big business. Big business, why is that an enemy of the family? It concentrates power, right, and takes away the power to families, and therefore is deleterious to their health and well-being. So we have these 2 concentrations of power, and of course what we know is exactly what Chesterton said over 100 years ago when he wrote this book in 1912. Right? He said that there's an eternal alliance of Hudge and Gudge. Big government and big business have always been in bed with each other. You can go all the way back to Reformation England and they're in bed with each other, right? It's fake that they're separate. That's a myth that we have in our political landscape so that we think we pit one against the other, right? And we have this eternal go round and round in circles, right? And we got to get off that merry-go-round. So the other one, I think, which is really important, which I think Chesterton does mention, and I talked about this with Mike on the phone, and a later distributist, I can't remember the name of this person, it was on the Distributist Review. He called the third character Sludge. So we've got Hudge, Gudge, and Sludge. Okay, so Sludge is the name of a technocrat, right? And so we'd think of somebody as a technocracy, right, as a kind of social institution and state of culture and society in which we deify technology. We take our orders from technology, right? We get all of our solutions from technology. So this mindset, I think, which is what Chesterton would have called over-specialization. We want there to be a specialism about everything. And then, of course, we get lots and lots of multiplication of experts. And again, what does that do? That concentrates the power of knowledge, right, in special groups, rather than giving us the knowledge we need to live the life ourselves. Okay. So when it comes to Catholic social teaching, the principles that some of you are familiar with, of course, some of the big ones, the dignity of the human person, subsidiarity, and solidarity. So let's say it as a distributist, the dignity of the family, which obviously that includes the dignity of the human person, right? And subsidiary would be the natural function of the family not being taken over by any other powers in society like big government or big business or technocracy, right? And of course, solidarity. And so subsidiarity and solidarity go together, and when those are together, that is how we help the health of the family or the dignity of the human individual and the human family. So I think we've got the fundamental value is the health of the family, and then the 3 enemies are Hudge, Gudge, and Sludge. So I tried to tell you a little bit about what distributism is, right? It's a social philosophy and it's a tradition, and what it isn't. Right? And then I tried to tell you a little bit about the fundamental values and the fundamental enemies. So I think that's good to maybe start a conversation. I think there's a lot more because there's a lot of misunderstandings about distributism that I'd be happy to respond to in a back and forth time. So if that's sufficient for now, I think to start a conversation, I'm happy to go to the next phase. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Plato. So a common contention or example that is brought up by critics is, well, distributism relies on government. It needs to rely on government in order for it to be implemented. and you say that's not the case. Are you saying that this has to start with culture? You have to attack culture first before you can even get to that point? Or is it only just culture we have to look at, and the government doesn't really matter at the end? What say you to?
So I really love Father Vincent McNabb because he comes into the distributist discussion and he clarifies things almost down to like slogans. And so one of the slogans, the McNabian slogans I want to introduce, which I think is so beautiful, which helps contextualize a bit of what Dr. Plato just gave us here, which is to state clearly and stands in stark opposition to a capitalist-oriented society and a socialist-oriented society, is the basic understanding that the family is the core unit of social order. So that is a McNabb slogan. The family is the core unit of social order. That is the distributist position. Clarified down, I mean, per subsidiarity, that's the base. That's the lowest level of authority is the head of a household. And so I want to get to your question, but I want to kind of complement some of the things that Dr. Plato just gave us right there with McNabb kind of sloganeering. McNabb had a tendency of going into like discussions of English distributists, which were in some cases verbose. They're like, long-winded and essayists and all these things, and distill things and challenge them to action. And that's a big role of what the contemporary land movement finds itself trying to do now. So the second McNabb slogan that I want to introduce that complements the idea of the family being the core unit of society, he says the family is the smallest unit of the nation. That is actually verbatim McNabb. The next one is that the home is the home is the best defense of freedom, and an economically productive homestead is the best defense of the home. And so that goes to the bottom-up power, which kind of answers gets into the answer of your question, which I'm going to get to in a minute. So the idea that a productive household where there is no debt, where the primary things that household needs are produced within it in close relationship to community, that the access to what McNabb called first things, water, food, shelter, fuel, and clothing, that the ability to produce those things in a community scale created a social condition that ensured and created a bulwark against tyranny from a state, from a cultural context, from whatever it is. When a community or a home had the ability to do those things, then they were safeguarded in a particular way. And that is a core understanding of distributists, is that what we are trying to do is create, both in principles to illuminate, but then in practicality to try and cultivate a social order that guarantees primary things within arm's reach of a community and a family. And that property is held safely, that somebody can't come because I have debt or I have a social condition. The state says, oh, I'm going to seize your property because, that's it. So that's what we do, right? And so my answer to address your question directly is that oftentimes there is a tactical side, a tactical discussion. We actually talked about this when we were on the phone, that wants to pit various tactics against one another. Can a distributist seize the authority of the state to enact distributist policy? My answer would be yes, that's a possible pathway. Another possible pathway that I think works in concert with that is laying the cultural foundation to accept distributism. So if I were to give every one of you 2 acres of beautiful forest, a mill, and an axe, how many of you could build a house from it? Right? So we need, there needs to be a base culture that's transmitting traditions and skills within a context of home and localized production in order to affect distributist goals. There's a whole way that men teach each other skills and tasks outside of institutions. And so a distributive society would be one in which the social fabric was teaching each other skill. This is bottom-up power. This doesn't necessitate government policy, although government policy could indeed support it. It's one in which we have a culture of relation where I say, hey, Dr. Plato, I'm going to go butcher 100 chickens. Can you help me? I'll help you next week when you need to fell that oak that's leaning up against your house or whatever it is. That having the association to conduct those types of relationships is a cultural texture. And in order to establish that cultural texture from our current position, which does not have that, takes intention. So my answer to you is that as distributists, and hopefully some young distributists in the audience, don't buy in to the idea that we divide each other among tactics. There needs to be policy on the government authority level that's supporting private ownership and productive households. There's currently policy barriers right now. I go all around the country and talk to milk producers or farmers or other people who are coming up against policy barriers to productivity, to cultivating productivity in their community and household. So that needs to be addressed. We also need bottom-up power in which we restore the fraternal bonds between one another, where we relearn what peer-to-peer colloquial education looks like, where we relearn what community mutual aid looks like, and we implement and grow in association from that direction. So both sides is the answer.
I think that's good. I think maybe I'll say a little bit more about my specific kind of distributism because it's relevant to this. So I kind of gave you a framework of I think a general way to think about it. So I would call myself an anti-state post-liberal distributist. And let me try to say a couple things about that. The modern state to me is a way that we have organized governments, whether it's a monarchy or an oligarchy or a democracy. This doesn't matter to what a modern state is. So if you think about from history, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, right? That's when the principle of he whose region his the religion was a principle from earlier on in the post-Reformation era, which was implemented all across Europe. And what this did is it allowed the temporal ruler to then determine what the religion was in his area, right? And it was meant to resolve, right, the difficult problems of what I call World War II, which was the religious wars before that. So there was a major conflict in Europe involving all the major powers, and that was the wars of religion, and they ended with the Peace of Westphalia. And what Innocent X said about that is pretty startling. And I'm not going to be able to quote him exactly, but he said something like, these two treatises, the Peace of Westphalia. There were two different treatises. He said these treatises are null, void, wicked, unjust, reprobate, empty for all of time. So that was the Catholic opinion of the Peace of Westphalia. So what we have here is the first sort of building block of what we call the modern state. And the modern state is characterized by not just centralizing authority, right? Centralizing authority isn't new in human history, but centralizing authority, that the top is the supreme authority, it's unshareable, right? So that authority that's supreme at the top cannot be shared with anybody else or any other institution like the church, say, right? And all the other authorities beneath it come from it. So that view is contrary to both subsidiarity and solidarity and contrary to justice. And to me, right, when we look at what modern states have done in history, even though we call them legitimate, they look just like tyrannical despotisms from the pagan era. And so I think we have a major problem here when we're thinking about the modern state. And no matter what kind we have, whether it's a monarchy, democracy, or aristocracy, oligarchy, whatever, that doesn't matter if it's this view of the nature of political authority. So to be anti-state is to be against that, right? Which means I think that my form of distributism is a radical critique, right? When I say radical, I don't mean crazy, I mean at the very roots, right? The roots of political authority. And I really like what Mike said when he said the family is this first sort of first society itself. So the family is a society. It's not, I don't like the metaphor, but it's a unit of society, right? It is a society, right? It's a full society, and that's what Catholic social teaching repeats over and over again. This society is independent, right, of the political community that might develop with it, right, or without it. And it has, I would say, every element that every level of society has above it. So think of it the way Andrew Jones, who's a political philosopher and a friend of mine who I really like his teaching and his work, he thinks of the family as creating a fractal pattern, right? And fractal patterns in nature, you know, they repeat at a whole bunch of different levels. So if you look at the nature of authority within a family, right, you've got authority and obedience, you have law, you have punishment, you have coercion, right, you have tradition, right, you have religion, you have a culture, you have all these elements within a family are the very same things in the same order that you get at higher levels of society. So it's not only a basic unit to build on, like a cell within a body, right? It's the pattern that's to be repeated all the way up, right? And so, so I think that idea of the family as basic is so radical that when I look at the modern state, to me, it's a total, the modern state itself is a radical technology. It's a technology invented to solve a certain problem. And when you look in history, you see that it created another technology, right? And that technology we could call the market system. And when I say the market system, capital M, capital S, right? So a great book to look at this into more detail if you want to follow up this, I would recommend Karl Polanyi's book, The Great Transformation. And in the beginning of this, he talks about how in the 1800s, that whole century from 1800 to 1900 was compared to previous century relatively peaceful. There were various conflicts, they didn't last very long, and if you added up all the conflict in that time period, it was like 18 months. Compared to the previous century, it was like 70 years out of 100. So it was like radically different, and yet that century ended with one of the most destructive wars and conflicts we've ever seen in history, World War I. And so Polanyi says, how did that happen, right? And in that book, he describes how the market system, right, and that is, again, not just markets with a capital, like with a little m, like we go to the farmer's market, or we have a place to buy and sell things, but a system, right, a model, a technology. What happened, he said, is the Adam Smith's idea of the free market, right, which he created a system of that and tried to create a scientific understanding of it, which was meant for England domestically. And what Polanyi describes is that the international elites of Europe decided to implement that system for the entire European affair. So an international market system. And how did they implement it? He describes they created an international financial institution that didn't exist before that. How did they do that? Well, they followed David Hume's idea of a gold standard. So now they have an international financial market and they can control European affairs as elites through controlling the international market, financial market. And what he said is that laissez-faire, right, laissez-faire capitalism, he said, as contrary to what I learned when I was younger, he said, I always said, well, we didn't have enough regulations and that was the problem. And we need to get more regulations to kind of like manage the laissez-faire, you know, system. It's too hands-off, right? And what he said is, no, laissez-faire was planned. That was an intentional implementation of this market system, right? And then he describes socialism, which there's lots of kinds of socialisms. Communism isn't the only kind of socialism. And of course, all socialisms the Catholic Church is against. But socialism, Polanyi says, was a reaction. It wasn't the planned economy. It was a reaction to the destruction of human dignity that was unleashed by this market system. So I think one of the biggest things that I find here at Franciscan that a lot of students have trouble seeing in distributism is their radical critique of what we call capitalism, right? Or I would call the market system. And we have this right-wing sort of hangover, right? That we have to like economic liberalism, right? Or what they call capitalism or libertarianism, right? But when you look at its philosophy and you look at its history, it's equally as dark and horrible as socialism. And of course, that's what all the early Catholic social thinkers, right, thought. That's what the popes thought, right? From Leo XIII all the way up to JP2. Whenever they said capitalism, right, with I can think of maybe one exception, and I'll get to that if you want to. Whenever they use the word capitalism, they don't mean values like free market, enterprise, right, ingenuity, invention. They don't mean any of those values. They mean the actual thing implemented in history, a concrete social economic order, right, which is contrary to human dignity. And the word that JP2 started using later in his career was just consumerism, right? And you can see the consequences of that. So when I think of like, what do we do with the, what do we need political policies, right? I think, well, it's almost like to me saying, should we use the One Ring, right, to defeat Sauron? I mean, that's almost what it feels like to me. So I'm not saying we shouldn't get in politics, right? I think the first place in politics we should get in is local politics, right? And we should absolutely infiltrate local politics wherever we go, right? And if you want to go higher, that's great, right? But you're going to find a totally broken bureaucratic machine in which mostly you will become corrupted, right? And be unable to do what you wanted to do when you first went in because the people around you are corrupted, right? But if you start at a local level and try to be politically involved, you're going to get a lot more success, right? So I agree with there are political routes and we can pursue political things, but building a culture is fundamentally not a policy political thing at all. It's just a bunch of friends, right? And a bunch of people that have a social bond and a goal that they're working together that builds a fabric, right? That is something we all take ownership of, call it the common good, right? And then we are able to build something that we can give to our children. They can give it to their children, right? And that's the old school word for capitalism, was just inheritance. It's what we give right to the next generation. So that's my kind of long answer to the question, but also I wanted to say a little bit more about my own particular point of view as a distributist. Yeah.
Can I respond to that just quickly? We've talked about two parts of Catholic social teaching: subsidiarity and solidarity. Both of those serve almost what I would say like a third thing, and that third thing, which we just said briefly there, was human dignity, the essential dignity and place of the human. And so I want to echo that when we use the word technology, the use of techniques, of various techniques to accomplish a thing. And very accurately, Dr. Plato is describing the modern technology of government as a series of techniques to manage economy, the political monopoly of violence, justice, like there's education, a whole bunch of different things, right? So if you get involved in politics, you are subject, in the contemporary sense, if I want to get into the technical apparatus of politics, I reduce myself to as a functionary of the techniques necessary to make strides there. And so as you enter politics, that should be something that you do willingly. What the Distributus does, and what is grounded in Catholic social teaching, is fundamentally subsidiarity and solidarity serve human dignity. And human dignity is grounded in an encounter with both creation and our fellow men that is holistic, that is outside of reducible techniques or functions. There might be technique or function incorporated. Yes, it's creative. Dignity, if you go back, a dignity, dignus, worthy, and then a Proto-Italia, a dec. Dec is exchange, acceptance, take. That's what the core root of this word dignity is. At the core of dignity is our exchange and creation between one another, that recognize, and that's what really makes us special in the image of the Creator, right? That's where our human dignity comes from. And so this is all to say that the approach from the distributist in healing the brokenness of the technical systems of modernity, or back to your question or expose in the beginning about modernity is a serious problem. That our approach to the solution is one that is grounded in its function, in its expression in human dignity, meaning that we come together as brothers under our Father, fully dignified as people. We exchange and negotiate our God-given position in this temporal order in the fullness of our humanity. And that comes with relationships to how we eat, how we find water, how we keep our houses warm, how we tend to our children, the order of our family, all of those things. And so distributists operate with a core recognition of human dignity in all cases. It doesn't mean that I won't try and run for local political office or other things, but it's an awareness that those modern systems require democracy itself requires a series of techniques in order to function. And so as I participate with those, I'm going to have to accept those, and they are reductions of a fullness of human encounter in our maturation and relationship to authority, temporal order, creation, God, everything else. So
Preach it, brother.
yeah, right on.
Oh, that was very good. So you're pretty much saying that as far as getting into politics and implementing, in a manner of speaking, distributism, it is one exercise prudentially. It would be okay. Great. So then my follow-up would be, so in the event that someone will say, well, distributism is very medieval, it's very anti-growth. So capitalism is very, we must grow because man, needs to grow. It's like a tree. We can't always remain as a sapling. So, and people will say, well, distributism just wants to remain, like a sapling almost. So how would you contend against that idea where distributism does not want to just relegate man to just, the farm or something of that effect?
My first thought was about your idea of growth, right? So modernity, modernity is obsessed with progress. I mean, cancer progresses, cancer grows, right? I mean, what kind of growth are we talking about? We're talking about an ordered growth, order, wellness, health, well-being. That's the growth we want, right? So what does that look like in human society? Does that look like more and more and more and more and more and more material affluence, but more and more and more and more and more suicide and mental illness? It doesn't look like that. That's the opposite, right? So that's destruction, not growth, right? So to me, it's back to the human, right? Humanum, right? How do we give man not only property in terms of material property? Let's define property as whatever man needs, right? And of course, how we answer the question of need as a philosopher would be to refer to the nature, right, of man, right? So just as a plant needs water, not gasoline, right? So human beings need certain things. They need food, they need shelter, they need those sort of things materially, but they also need a place, right? A house, a shelter, right? But they also need, right, weapons, right, to protect themselves, right? They also need to have not only material things, but mankind has a soul. He has property in the truth, right? He has property in spiritual things, which we would call education. And as a philosopher, that's to me one of the biggest questions in the history of philosophy. That's what Plato's Republic is all about. Education, that's what the allegory of the cave is, right? How do we discover the truth about our good? We have property in that. And culture, right, as Joseph Pieper would define it, right, is the quintessence of all the natural goods of the world, plus all those gifts and qualities of man, right, that extend beyond what's merely useful to things that are intrinsically valuable, things that I would call soul food. Culture is soul food. And we have property in that, right, as human beings, human nature. And so we need to restore all that kind of property if we're going to grow as human beings. And growth as human beings, I think, in the positive sense would be, like we said, creativity, love, right, enjoyment, right, where we can play, right, we can do things that are intrinsically valuable culturally, poetry, right, we can have crafts together, we can do things that are intrinsically meaningful, right. That to me is what it's about. And so how do you do that? That seems like that is something that tradition was much better at. Now, I am so thankful, don't ever get me wrong, that we have, lots of medical technologies and we don't have 1 out of 4 infants dying, right? And we have a lot of material things. I mean, we have it's amazing what we've done. It's totally true. I'm not downing that, but Christ said, right, what good is the whole world, right, if you lose your soul? What profit is that, right? He even said things like, if you're sinning, cut off your hand, right? Gouge out your eye, right? I mean, he's not a fan of mutilation, but he's a Jew, so he can use hyperbole, okay? So the point is we should want to give up those material things, right, if they are an enemy of our soul. It's worth it in every case, right? So maybe in some sort of other possible world when we didn't have the Reformations the way we did, and Belloc imagines this. He imagines what would the Industrial Revolution have looked like if we hadn't abandoned the Catholic Church and that authority, right? If we hadn't given that up. It doesn't mean there wouldn't have been industrialization. It doesn't mean there wouldn't have been technological, medical developments, but they would have looked a lot different. They would have been in a lot different order than we had them, right? So, yeah. I don't know if I'm addressing your question, but...
Right, yeah, that was certainly good, Michael.
So I want to go right to the question and kind of attack the idea of myth of progress very, very clearly. John Michael Greer, for people who know him, has a beautiful explanation of some technological progress, right? In every technological step, there's a diminishment of returns as we progress further along a technological scale, meaning that the technique and the complication of technique comes with its own consequences. And those consequences at first are subtle. But as the techniques to effectuate, right, technology is born from a type of need of agency, right? We have to get X, Y, Z done. Which one I get you? I want to almost ask you to give me one. I'll do transportation as one though, right? Well, actually, let's do communication because that's a good one. So we have communication and instantaneously no, actually, I'm sorry. I'm going to go back to transportation. We're going to do transportation because it's clear in my mind right now. So we have transportation as a need, right? First step is like horse-drawn, and then carriages, and there is social consequence to having horses everywhere, carriage houses. All right, now we have a whole a genre of work with teamsters and people who are, utilizing horses to get from place A to place, B. Then we introduce a more complicated technology in the past 200 years of the automobile. And the automobile has a vast consequences for society. At first, subtle, right? Not too many people own them, but then as the personal automobile increases, we get more and more consequences to the point where the society begins to take shape. The consequences build so dramatically for the ubiquitous introduction of the automobile that the geographic landscape begins to change around it. We get highways. All of a sudden, our downtowns are gutted. All of a sudden, it takes me 30 minutes to drive to get simple goods, where my simple goods used to be in much closer walking or horse distance. Now I need to drive great distances. So the technological consequence of solely utilizing technological agency is you see the diminishing returns, that things are getting farther away, right? Until eventually we have situations in some places where people are not even able to drive to get their basic goods now. Right, so they have to get Amazon stuff shipped to them in order to so the communities are completely obliterated. There's not walkable communities anywhere. Our cities we're not even able to walk through one of these things that the urban planners put in cities. What are they? The roundabouts. You can't even walk through them. We've eliminated the basic level. So there are our phones are another good one, right? We've never been so connected and so separate, right? So now we have the ability to instantaneously talk to everybody on the planet and access huge bodies of information, but we are so isolated, we are dying. We are so isolated that our communities are fracturing and the very fabric of social life is disintegrating because of technology. And so my question to the fundamental idea of capitalism, I don't want to start a huge debate, but the fundamental idea is that the laissez-faire capitalism, we free capital to move across as many lines to answer the questions of humanity, and it will naturally coalesce into technological agency that will then give us greater means to solve our problems. That is a fundamental myth that is demonstrably not true. It's a religion. It's a religion around technology. And so my answer is, in our lives, do you see in a 100-year process, do you see, or even in your own life right now, do you see a healthy life, one that's integrated in a holistic manner with your family or with your community, as one that is integrated into technology all the time? Or does community emerge and real encounter with your family emerge when you disengage technology? Just ask yourself that question. So that fundamental myth that's driving capitalism and the myth of progress is false. It's demonstrably false in our lives right now. And what distributism is suggesting is that we center that truth. The original English distributists adopted a name. They didn't call themselves distributists. They call themselves realists because they were dealing with what was actually real and true. And so that is my refuting of like the myth of progress of like, my question would be, do we need vast technological apparatus to conduct human affairs? Is it benefiting us? Or should we center what is good and true in our lives? And what does that look like? It looks like a society fundamentally shaped by the values of distributism.
I'm just going to jump in with a word because I mentioned earlier that distributism as a social philosophy takes religion as fundamental to human society. And that's the case even in a totally secular society like ours. There's a religion. And so the myth, right, of technology and the myth of progress, the religious word for that is superstition, right? We have a superstitious belief in the advantages of technology and the advantages of effectiveness and the advantages of these systems that we created. We're totally superstitious. We're the most credulous people ever. We have blind faith, right, in these things. We are unable to have reason again. Reason itself is being defeated, right, by this process. Think about AI. It's obvious, right? People think AI is absolutely stunningly intelligent, right? It's impossible for it to be intelligent. It might be a stunning computer, right? It can compute things that no human being can ever compute, even if that human being lived to be 1 million years old. So absolutely, it's an amazing computer, right? But right now, AI inventors have given up trying to make it do plumbing in a 100-year-old house. It can't go into a 100-year-old house and fix the plumbing, right? You think it can tell a teenager how to live life? Right? This is ridiculous, right? And yet we worship it. We're ready to worship it, and we're ready to have every single job implement something AI, right? As if that's not going to push out other things, like you said. It's going to utterly change society. That's the lesson of every single philosopher of technology that I've studied, and I've studied this issue. They all say it impacts sociality. Society itself is what changes from technology. There's always a social cost, right? And of course, you never count that when you're inventing a technology because the social cost comes later, right? Technologies are all really helpful now. That's why we invented them, because they're really helpful now. They're faster, they're better, they're more efficient. So if all you're looking at is now, then they're always going to justify themselves. But if you're looking at them long term, you're like, oh my gosh, what did we do, right? And we're still trying to catch up to what we did, right, with computers, let alone, right, social media and smartphones, let alone AI. We're implementing these things so fast, there's no way we can even think about it. We can't even realize what we've done. And that's because we're so stinking superstitious.
All right, so this will be the time where audience members can come over here to ask questions, and a person in the blue jacket is going to hold the microphone. So try to be brief with your questions, please.
Damian, make sure that you leave time for closing.
Yeah, we have enough. Great.
I'm going to try to answer briefly that question.
Hi, just want to first start by saying thank you for this talk. I found it very enlightening. I just wanted to begin with like a clarifying question. Is it fair to say that this distributist movement can be categorized as kind of very agrarian? It relies a lot upon agriculture. That's fair?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm well suited to answer that from the land movement perspective. So yes, I would say that essentially the core tenets of distributism, meaning a productive property and means of production well distributed across a social body, essentially has an agrarian component. The means of production being like a plow in the soil as the base. If we take subsidiarity all the way down, it eventually reaches to the soil itself and our relationship to it. And so yes, there is an agrarian element to that.
Got it. And then following up with that, I mean, what would you say to the objection that like the Industrial Revolution, modernity is like a bell you can't unring, saying that we can go back to agrarian societies? Would we have to kind of abandon our pursuit of technology in the electronic sense and kind of how society functions now? We're going to have to give up a lot of those pursuits in order to embrace kind of an older agrarian society.
So can I answer this one too? So I can answer with the words of the distributists from 1932 in The Cross and Plow, is that the idea of material determinism is an idol in and of itself. The idea that we are materially determined takes away our agency and free creativity. Does that make sense? To say that there is an inevitability in a material situation is condemning us as slaves to the material. So I do not believe in a linear material progression that can't be undone or reconstituted, or human social society. If you look at the guild system, they were regulating candlelight for production. If you look at various societies, they picked up various technologies and said, we're going to put these away because they're no good. They put away certain social orders. Happens over and over and over again in human history. So I reject the false idol of material determinism. It's fundamentally Marxist in my opinion, and nope, I don't buy that. So that would be my answer, is that many futures are possible, perhaps not evenly distributed amongst all people. Sorry for the pun, but that's...
All right, well, thank you.
I'm just going to add one little thought to that. I do think I do agree with Mike that distributism is essentially agrarian, but not exclusively agrarian, right? So obviously, you can be a distributist no matter where you are and what you're doing. It doesn't require that you become a farmer. It doesn't require you to work the land. But I say more power to you. You know, do it if you can, right? And it is to me a kind of truly beautiful human life, right? That kind of life. Right, and but there is a way within an industrial center or a city to absolutely be a distributist. You can have a little garden, you can do things even with your soil, you can sell flowers, you can make sourdough. There's all sorts of things you can do, right, in terms of right, a kind of person who has independence. But also, I wanted to comment that what Belloc said back in the 30s was that, yes, there are really big industries, huge industries, right, but none of those require the capitalistic separation of capital and labor. Right? And so if that's the case, then the danger of corporatism as centralizing power and wealth, right, can be mitigated by things like employee ownership, right? And that is scalable at any level, right? At any level of size of a corporation. And so insofar as we are all dependent on airplanes and automobiles and other things that have huge industries, right? Those can move towards the distributive vision by being employee owned.
I'm sorry, but this is one that we hit on when we were talking. We went right to it actually in our discussion. This is a discussion that distributists often happen. I would like to second qualify back to say that that we don't get too fanciful in our application of technique around distributist principles. That if we do that and drive away from human dignity at the core of it, then we run the risk of turning distributism into yet another technical system. And so I would kind of counter, and this is the discussion that distributists have all the time, that there is a certain level of scale. That scale is a consideration. I mean, the core word is a consideration of scale. But that scale is a consideration of distributist. If I own 0.000000001% of the widget factory assembling widgets, there is a recognition of my human dignity is not inherent in that. I can't work on an assembly line in the widget factory, even if I own 0.001%. That doesn't make it a distributist a widget factory, if that makes sense. We have to keep the core element of human dignity and what that means in a holistic encounter with humanity in an economic sense present in all the exchanges.
I agree with that. I do think that not only is agrarianism essential and not exclusive, but also I think there's a primacy to that. And in terms of, I don't want to say ideal in terms of an unlivable thing, because as Chesterton said, the test of possibility is actuality. We actually have lived in this way in the past, so we know it works, right? And so I do think that is the best way of living. We need to devolve, right? We need to devolve our central corporate and state powers. That's why I'm against the market system and I'm against the modern state. And so yes, in time. So I think that the kind of employee ownership would be the mitigation of evil rather than like establishing a pattern for good forever.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it seems evident that, especially in the past century, leftists have successfully, taken over the culture, mainly through their, taking over major institutions. I think of colleges, I think of, the economic sector, the press, all of these things, the arts. So it seems to me that we're sort of shooting ourselves in the foot if we want to make a more Catholic society and not do so through these higher institutions, but, fleeing to the fields, as the book was in the pamphlet, or pursuing local office. So how would you say that this sort of method would better get us a Catholic culture when it's the exact opposite approach that has seemed to make our enemies so successful?
So two things. One, I hope that I was clear that I think the acquisition of power at the very top of things is important. And so I'm not pitting the tactical the land movement fulfills a particular need of a restoration of colloquial networks around education and mutual aid in land and hand agrarian crafts. It has far-reaching implications for like social order, but it is not pitted against somebody who says, I want to run for political office as like a state senator or something. My question to them would be, what kind of state senator? All too often, the right wing, which you would hold as opposition to the left wing, loops right back around to constitutional libertarianism, laissez-faire economies, neoconservative kind of stuff in the American sense, and they are more left wing, in my opinion, in this, these left and right concepts. So my hopefully encouragement here is to say that if you, as a Catholic, want to acquire high-level power within institutions, or you want to focus on the base, that these two tactics are not in conflict with one another, but I want you to understand what I would identify as third position economics and what they are, why they're important, so that when you become part of the technical apparatus of politics, you're not thrown right into libertarian kind of economics or the invisible hand of the market garbage that is so predominantly, and that you hold in that high office the reality as a Catholic of human dignity, the reality of productive property ownership, of the family as the core thing that this institution should be cultivating, the health of the family on productive property. I want those to be forefront in your mind. And so, that's what I would say. I hope I haven't come across to say I'm tactically opposed to either one. I think they work in concert. I'd like to see them both, and I'd like the people who have fled to the fields to understand third position and Catholic economics. I would like the senators that are Catholics to understand, the motivating principles of Catholic economics and Catholic social teaching. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
I was going to say, I think that just as going to the top or going up in seeking political power, right? That I'm not opposed to that, and I'm also not opposed to people going and living off the grid, right? I mean, I'm not opposed to either. I mean, this is, if we're Catholics, and I'm of course a Catholic distributist, right? Then I think that we're in a war, right? That's the image that Christ gave us, right? That's the image that St. Paul spells out multiple times. Right, we're in a battle not against flesh and blood, right, but against powers and principalities, and so that we're in a battle. So think like a warrior. Like think, where am I going to go get victory? Where am I going to get success? Anywhere and everywhere is free game, right? There's no just Benedict Oppen or free or like fundamentalism and go start our own institutions and leave all the others aside. Go in the other ones, start new ones, do everything, right? There's no limitation to that. And yeah.
Evident, the acquisition of institutional power, a college professor, me, a farmer, a builder by trade, who's working in like lay association with very little institutional power. But did you see, we've only had about 45 minutes of a conversation before this, but do you see, because our core principles are clear and we are together, have taken the time to understand Catholic social teaching, that we are unified in our fight. Dr. Plato, you're my brother. We are in the same trench together. We are an expression of a tactical diversity of what this war against principalities in the contemporary temporal orders looks like.
I think it's really important to notice that, because when we had a conversation, we both mentioned how we are, now this term is a floppy term, right? But we're both post-liberals. Right, and there's a way to interpret that rightly, and what I think that means is that, we are not interested in sort of like right-wing populist nationalism, just as we're not interested in all this other stuff, in libertarianism or liberalism, right? It's like everything on the radar screen to me doesn't look like Catholic social teaching, right? And so we have to do it again, right? We have to start over, so to speak. And of course, we already are, because we have families, and it has to start over with families. There's no other way for society to go forward, right? And so I think that I would want to say that we are also not, we need to detach ourselves from that sort of like, I don't know, Americanist point of view. Like, I am a patriot. I love America, and I love the history of America, and I think it's a really important discussion to have. But to me, the way in which some right-wing nationalist way of thinking about America to me seems not Catholic, right? It seems like Catholicism's like subsumed under America, as opposed to it being the other way around. Okay.
What would centers of specialization look like? Specifically, non-productive centers of specialization, such as hospitals and universities, perhaps churches, on a distributist model. Aren't some people just doomed to be distanced from the means of production?
Corporal works of mercy is the territory of the church in the historical societies that, you know, the hospitals and other things were put together by the church. That's why they still to this day carry the stamp of the church in so many places. St. Jude's this, you know, whatever it is, all the hospitals and various things. And so there, the negotiation of like what things would look like without, you know, with like the victory of a distributistly oriented society and the cessation of the modern state, you know, would look like the shared power structures of guilds, hereditary lines of power, and the church as a functioning part of society. My you know, push back against that is, or not that you're saying this, but it's in there somewhere, would be, is profit-driven, economically integrated corporal works of mercy like medicine and other things working well right now in America? And you know, that would be, it's not working too well for anybody involved right now, I would say.
I also think, I don't know, maybe I misunderstood your question, but to me the productive, non-productive isn't so much about your career necessarily. So you could work in a hospital and have 2 acres, right, and have a level of independence and productive property and assets. So I'm not sure you were assuming that or whether you would think that, but to me, like, hospitals are a great example to me of technocracy. And so they don't have to be technocratic, and there could be hospitals with all the amazing techniques, but they don't have to be technocratic,
yes.
Right? And so one word I really like is, I like the word personalism, right? And so to me, hospitals would be personalistic. I mean, I've had a lot of family members who have had, both extended and close family members who have had health problems, right? And I've found a lot of amazing healers and healing help, not just through conventional medicine, but yes, through conventional medicine, but through naturopathic medicine and functional doctors. And to me, it seems like there needs to be a broadening out of medical philosophy, if I can call it that, to account for, again, the dignity of the human individual. And so I think hospitals would be less bureaucratic and less mechanistic and less impersonal than that's how they would be on a distributist model, which carries the Catholic social teaching values, right, in its culture. So I don't know if that's addressing or if it's too big of a, too high level, or if you wanted more specifics.
Yeah, thank you, gentlemen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to ask whether you think the family precedes the state or not, and also, how is your view of the family distinct from John Locke's view of natural rights in the state of nature?
I can say maybe the first question you had was, does the family precede the state? Yes.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. That's fundamental to Catholic social teaching. It is a society in and of itself, and remains a society in and of itself, right? Even within the modern state, and that's part of the reason why I'm opposed to the modern state, because it says all authorities and powers come from the modern state, which isn't true, right? And so it tries to colonize, right, every level beneath, right, to extract power and wealth up, right? So the other question about Locke is, maybe I could approach it by saying, his view of private property, it contrasts, right, with the Catholic view of private property spelled out really clearly in Rerum Novarum, which many of you mentioned that you had read. And so the way he explains property rights leads to a for lack of a better term, abuse of property, right? So property rights mean I can use and abuse my property, right? Whereas what the Catholic says is no, whatever rights you have in property, right, those are consistent with human nature and therefore with the universal destination of all goods. And so property is always constrained, right, by man's social life. And it can't be, what do I say, it can't be individualized. There's no such thing as completely and utterly individualized private property. It always has a function within the common good in society. And so I think Locke's concept of a natural right to property, that we go out there and we work the land or whatever, so then I own it like absolutely, like I own my body. Well, you don't own your body absolutely, and you don't own the land absolutely, right? You only have a right to use it within the common good. You don't have a right to abuse it just because it's yours. So I don't know if that's kind of the questions you were thinking, or?
Yeah, I also from where I'm coming from, maybe this is wrong, but I think the state has authority over the family. Is that incorrect, or?
In Rerum, so I can speak to Rerum Novarum specifically addresses and answers this question. And Pope Leo XIII clearly states that the rights of man in relationship to his property and his ability to render the sustenance of his body, to access the mercy that God has left for us, both in our role of dominion and the soil itself, it precedes the rights of any state. So he explicitly says that. And so that position is my position.
I think I would like to respond to that too with we mentioned subsidiary multiple times, and I think that in conversations about Catholic social teaching and not just in conversations about distributism, oftentimes subsidiarity is sort of like a policy strategy, right? Let's make policies such that the guys on top don't take responsibilities from underneath, and the guys underneath are able to do by policies the things that they should do. To me, subsidiarity is a metaphysical principle. Subsidiarity is the idea that reality is hierarchical, right? And the hierarchies above, right, exist for the sake of bringing the lower ones up for care, right? So the higher you are, the more you care, right? And so God is the primary example. He comes all the way down to the lowest to start bringing it up, and we go down to the lowest and bring it up, and then the angels come down and bring us up. And it's all that coming down and coming back up is subsidiarity. Yeah, I think that's definitely relevant here as well. And yeah, maybe you can have a follow-up and get us going to address your question if we haven't nailed it yet.
Yeah. So do you think that the state can have authority over, but their authority is ordered towards protecting rights of the family?
Absolutely. That's what it's for, right? That's one of the main purposes of government, right? To protect us.
Do you think it still can have the authority, the ability to coerce families, into acting against their will and still protect these rights? Or
whatever it has an authority to do cannot violate the rights, if I can use that language, of what's below.
Bingo. That's
right, and so on, with all levels in between. So yes, it has proper authority, it has a proper sphere of authority and a proper exercise of it. But it couldn't, for example, say, you know what? You parents, you don't have a choice in how you educate your children. We're just going to do that for you.
That's
right. It has no authority in that. If it does anything unjust, if a government acts unjustly or passes an unjust law, it doesn't have authority even if they say it does. And the law isn't a law just because we say it is. As Augustine says, an unjust law is no law at all. And so it only has authority to do what's right. It only has an authority to do what's just. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
So the term distributism alludes to the distribution of property, which you said is what man needs. And Michael, you gave the example of everyone getting 2 acres. But you also said that that's worth nothing if you don't have the prerequisite knowledge to use it. And so I think a huge part of distributism is this education. And you talked about colloquial, fraternal education. So I'm wondering pragmatically, what does that look like in communities? And as a seminarian specifically, I'm interested in knowing what can that look like in parish life? What could catechesis on Catholic social teaching and also building these distributist communities look like?
Yeah.
So this is why I'm